Can you hear me?
Okay.
My question was for Nadia. I wanted to ask this during your presentation, but how do you choose the number of high and low risk people when you're doing your modeling?
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's very hard, obviously, to estimate in the real world how many people are high risk and how many people are low risk. For our model, we base it a little bit off of concurrency data, which is very controversial in the sense that we don't know if the data that's out there is actually representative of what's happening in the real world, but that's really the only thing that we have to truly base those numbers off of. So we assume, because high risk in our model means having much higher partnership acquisition rates, we assume they'll have more partners, and therefore they'll be in concurrent partnerships. So that's how we get that proportion.
Any other questions from today? Yeah?
My question is just to anyone who might have an opinion on this. It regards the infant that has possibly been cured. I noticed that it was a kind of a bombardment with the treatment, and I was wondering if you guys at all think this is a possible, it's all at all valid. Partly because of my personal experience. My mom was recently diagnosed with Lyme disease, and she had it for 20 years, and it was misdiagnosed. And once they began treatment, they hit her really, really hard and really long with antibiotics, and that's when her levels went down. So I was wondering if hitting it hard and hitting it fast and hitting it long if that's a potential treatment.
So for people, there was a transmission, mother-infant transmission in Mississippi that occurred a number of years ago. The mom came into care very late in her pregnancy, delivered early in her pregnancy, was not exposed to antivirals in utero. The infant was treated within 24 hours. There was evidence that the infant was infected, and then they disappeared after a relatively short course of treatment, both for the mom and the child. And then, lo and behold, they reappeared sometime later, and there's apparently no evidence that the child has HIV infection. Whether or not this is, a very unusual case in terms of the natural history of HIV transmission between mother and infant pairs that we've just never observed before, whether this is sort of, for whatever reason, a novel, unusual situation because of the timing of therapy, no one really knows. And there's really, at this point, we really have to wait and see if there's evidence later on that the child does develop HIV infection, but early indications are that there's no evidence, no direct evidence of viral replication. So people are calling it a functional cure, but I think it's really too early to make too much out of this observation. So I don't know, Don, if you want to.
The notion is exciting that there does appear to be a cure by having an infant that you hit fast and hard, and so people are trying that, and there are some experimental systems in the SIVs too that are looking in the same way. There's a glimmer here that it may be possible by doing that. One of the important things, I don't think that's going to be in itself an important advance, because it's going to be too hard to find people early in their infection to do that. But the question is whether or not it'll teach us something about how we can apply the lessons from those kind of therapies and then extend them and develop new therapies to take advantage of it. Yeah, but it's yet another incremental advance.
Okay, what other question?
A question for Dr. Kobe. The question was where you said the amino acids in the viral proteins changing didn't have necessarily an effect on the function of the proteins. Then what was it precisely that you think it was causing the function of the viral proteins to change over time?
So when I was talking about amino acid substitutions in the hemagglutinin of H3N2 not having a large effect, I was talking about it mostly in the context of effect on antigenicity, so on the effect, or rather, on the ability of the virus to escape most antibodies. It's easy to think of reasons why almost any amino acid substitution in the hemagglutinin could have some consequence for viral fitness. But most of those different aspects of hemagglutinin functionality, I think, haven't really been investigated, and so we're, I think, nowhere near being able to say that a particular substitution is definitely going to impact function. But
I have one more question about the graph that you had also.
Okay.
You showed seasonal flu compared to the other types of flu, and how over the course of time, like the prevalence of it and what had the damage it was causing to us, the fatality rate, I believe it was actually. So the seasonal flu barely went down at all, but all the other ones had more drastic drops. Is that because we're so used to the seasonal flu that more people have like a general resistance or the antibodies to it, or why was it that the seasonal flu kind of stayed straight and went down a little, and the other ones kind of like dove?
which
straight
plot
down?
are you actually talking about? Can
Yeah, I
someone?
think it was the fatality graph from the different types of flu. So you had like the
So that
seasonal, and then
was-
you had all the other ones.
So that was plotting the case fatality ratio as against the attack rate. And so there wasn't really a temporal trend in there. Seasonal flu in general has a much lower both attack rate and case fatality rate than the pandemic strains.
I just had a question about what kind of books would you recommend for like studying more about mathematical models? That's a general question.
Could I start with that? Well, there's a book that was published a couple years ago by Matt Keeling and Pej Rohani that's fantastic. And I don't know what it's called. But it's
Models of infectious disease? I don't know.
got a really
Something-
generic
It's
title.
got a generic title, but I agree, that's the state of the art.
First name Matt. Let me give you a slightly different angle on that. There is some good fiction that you could read too, and one of my favorites of all times is probably one of the classics. Is the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. It's about prediction and psychohistory and looking at trends and using computation to intervene in the future. And it's been awarded the best science fiction book of all time, and it is a great read. Another is a Nobel Prize winning book called the Glass Perlenspiel, the Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse, and it's about a society that lives by computation and thinking about games as all being computational games, and then eventually the tension between that and a more humanistic relationship, person to person. Another one that I like is called Past Watch. Orson Scott Card, another major award winner. It's another counterfactual where instead of the Americans discovering the new world, what happens in the long run is that the Americans end up taking over, the Native Americans end up taking over Europe. And so these are all cool in terms of just thinking about alternative histories and ways to computationally think about it. So they're good practical books too, but these are my favorites for the...
I agree with that. In between, I think, are, if you go, again, to the NetLogo site, it has one of its menus is Models Library. And if you open up the Models Library, it has a bunch of infectious disease models that you can play with that let you change the assumptions. It's got a good HIV one. It also has models like diffusion on a network, how do things spread on different networks. It's also got a model that I built on civil violence, where violence is an epidemic. So, again, I would just go ahead and start playing with models.
One more. Just I don't. It may be a secret, but my Gmail account name is Magister Ludi, which is the hero of the Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse. Just for the.
Just going to say, back on the topic of actually playing with models, the Keeling and Rohani book is associated with a website that has a lot of code, and I think MATLAB, C, and something else, maybe even R. So you can actually play with most of the examples in that book. And then another book that I'd recommend is by Ben Bolker, and it's not about infectious diseases per se, but it's a lot about, it's mostly about modeling population dynamics and understanding how models fail and how to fit things. And it's a really great book. And it's also supposed to be an introduction to R, and it's called Ecological Models and Programming in R. I've got what? Oh, okay, almost done. And I'm just going to say about that book, if you go to Ben Bolker, so this is Bolker, if you go to his website, he has a PDF of basically like the proof of the entire book, so you can just download it, and he has it for people to download. And it also has a lot of code associated with it.
Can I say one more? Yeah. So there's another terrific recent book by Nate Silver. It's called The Signal and the Noise. And Nate Silver, I don't know if you all followed the politics in the last election, but he predicted the presidential election spot on, state by state, the Electoral College perfectly. And he does basically just careful statistical modeling, but he wrote a very thoughtful book about statistical and predictive modeling in general. The reason I like it is that there's 3 pages devoted to Midas modelers. And in it, he says, now those guys are actually pretty thoughtful. They don't overextend themselves. They're good, even-headed, trustworthy modelers. So that's all.
He didn't interview me. That's why he says that.
I actually was going to ask about the books too, but along with the net logo, are there any other programs that y'all recommend that you can just get off online? Because it's really neat. And nope, that's it.
Curious to see what you guys think of Stella as a teaching tool.
Yeah, I know it a little bit. It's a different style of modeling. It's called systems dynamics modeling, which is more of a discrete event setting where you don't have individual agents interacting one on another spatially, but you have so-called state variables like total susceptibles, total infecteds, total removed, and it's still very revealing to build simple models where you say, yes, I'm going to model it as S times I with some transmission rate per contact, or S times I to some exponent to reflect that it might not be perfect SI, it might be some, or S times I times cosine of time, so it's seasonal, or beta is sinusoidal, or some other thing. It's a very handy environment for building difference equations, basically. Not differential equations exactly, but equations where there's a few state variables and you can watch how things unfold. It's very revealing to do both, actually, because the state variable one can arrive at an equilibrium, for example. And you build the agent version and it's, oh boy, the introduction of space really corrupts that. You don't get equilibrium when there's space, or you don't get equilibrium when there's heterogeneity. So it's good to be conversant with all those modeling tools, I think. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question, 2 questions for Dr. Epstein and one general. So Dr. Epstein, can you comment on the status of agent-based modeling in simulating the obesity epidemic? And is Hopkins and Midas involved in that particular field of agent-based modeling?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first question was just the general state of the field, or obesity specifically?
Obesity specifically.
Yeah, I have a colleague, Ross Hammond, at the Brookings Institution, and he and I did some agent-based modeling, and he's been doing more agent-based modeling on obesity. And there's a big center at Hopkins on obesity dynamics, of which I'm a part. And yeah, obesity is a good area to apply this trade, I think, because network effects are important, norms are important, biology is important, information is important, economics is important. I mean, it's a phenomenon that is the intersection of a whole variety of spheres. So I think it's a very rich area for agent modeling. It'll be hard to capture all of that. And there's also there's a nice applet, Kevin Hall, H-A-L-L, at NIH, has a nice applet he's got very, the state-of-the-art endocrinological, metabolic balance, energy balance, differential equations. But he's also got a nice applet that you can explore, basically different diets. So there's a lot going on. I think it's a very exciting area for agent modeling. Good question.
Do you have the name of that particular group that you're working with?
It's called the Global Center for Childhood Obesity.
And just a general question, how familiar are you guys with Star Logo as an alternative to Net Logo?
Star Logo is the predecessor of Net Logo. Net Logo is really the son of Star Logo. So I would just go to Net Logo.
Okay.
Although if you already know Star Logo, that'll be an easy hop.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and if you want to call me or email me if you're having trouble.
Okay. All right. All right, thank you.
Kind of a general question for the panel. Do you guys know what type of students like the CDC or the World Health Organization looks for? Like, are they more interested in PhDs, masters, MDs?
We've had a, you mean particularly going to the EIS, is that the Epidemic Intelligence Service or other places at CDC? Most of the people, most students want to end up as an EIS officer where they, they professionally become involved in epidemiology. And we have a range of students from that. Most are PhD. Most have had some experience in practical epidemiology, is that they are able to marry the theory and the practice, and that have had some sort of real shoe leather experience as part of their training. I think that's an important credential. But I've seen anthropologists and epidemiologists and parasitologists, and I don't think there's any one particular type that they look for, but they're looking for people that are smart and hardworking and are able to move back and forth between well-grounded in theory but having experience at the same time.
Maybe you don't suffer from the misconceptions that I suffered from 10 years ago, but I used to think that there was extensive in-house expertise at the WHO and even the CDC, and that there certainly is a lot within the CDC, but at least as far as flu goes, for example, the WHO has held at least 2 meetings on improving strategies for flu strain selection for the vaccines, and they're really mostly drawing people from, well, government labs definitely, but then also a lot of academics, like from the Harvard School of Public Health and from, I mean, just universities around the world. And the CDC also, at least the flu people there, interact extensively with academics at universities. So if you want to, do the kind of work that you might think of the CDC doing, you don't necessarily have to actually be working in-house, I guess is what I mean.
So this is a question for Dr. Epstein. This is kind of a minor question, but so with your model where you said that you set it up where the people that worked in the hospitals got vaccinated as well as the patients that came in and their families, right? So what about testing that out with vaccinating the families of the people that work at the hospitals? Because I'm not exactly sure the transmission of smallpox would, couldn't they just go home and transmit it to their family?
Yeah, that's a very good thought. And we looked at that. It's a very good idea. And all I can say is that's a great question, and it's a good idea, and you were born modeler.
Let me pose a question to you all. So one of the questions, if you're going to implement immunization of just some people, like first responders or people who work in hospitals, that in fact ended up being the recommendation, is that everybody who might be the emergency should get vaccinated. And that recommendation was made. It was partially implemented nationwide. So in some states, almost all the first responders got immunized against smallpox. In some states, almost nobody got immunized. This was in about, I think it was 2003 that this occurred. What do you think the single strongest predictor of whether or not you had a lot of people immunized in the state or few people immunized in the state was? Whether or not the governor was Republican or Democrat. And it's a statistically a very strong association. So when you're doing these kind of models, and you assume that a certain percentage of people will or won't get immunized, there are some pretty powerful externalities, realities that you have to bring into play on these. And I think that was probably the most dramatic of that, but it relates directly to who gets immunized and will they in fact do that, depending on what their own individual motives are.
I kind of have a question just for anybody who wants to answer it. When did you guys have your aha moment that you wanted to work with public health or wherever you guys wanted to apply yourself? What kind of drove you guys to want to do that?
Everybody in the shower.
Well, I've been interested in it for a long time. I did a book in 1996 called Growing Artificial Societies, where we built an agent-based infectious disease model with actual immune learning and transmission of idealized immune systems represented as strings of zeros and ones. So, you know, I've always thought infectious disease was fascinating, and infectious phenomena in general are fascinating. And what I didn't stop to talk about, and maybe other people did talk about it, is that there, in these famous equations, you can show that there's a tipping point where the ratio of, you know, two numbers, the transmission rate over the removal rate, if the susceptibles exceed that number, the thing takes off. And if it doesn't exceed that number, the thing fizzles. So the whole aim of vaccination is not to vaccinate everybody, but to vaccinate enough so that the remaining susceptible pool is under the threshold and the thing fizzles. And that's a very beautiful result. I mean, if you want an aha moment, learn those equations, and that's a lovely, simple result. And then I think it goes in a lot of directions. And I've used that same idea to study political movements and violence and lots of other things. So I don't know if there was an aha moment, but I think that would be a good source of aha moments.
Yeah, I didn't have an aha moment. I think I remember reading actually an article in the Atlantic Monthly when I was a college student, and it was on, I think it was called like a new germ theory or something on the evolution of virulence. And looking back, it was a really bad article, and the theory it described was actually not that great either. But it really excited me. And so I guess my answer is very similar to Josh and Dawn's in the sense that it's more that infectious disease continues to interest me because there's just always new stuff coming up. And it's not just that the pathogens are evolving, but also, I mean, human demography, human culture is changing rapidly. We have new treatments. So it's just a rich set of things to study.
Yeah, so I don't really particularly have an aha moment, except that, you know, I was really coming from more of a classic chronic disease epidemiology background. And what intrigued me about HIV was that it blends both. I mean, it's the most interesting virus and most interesting disease to study because it has all the characteristics of an infectious disease, sexually transmitted agent, but with this incredibly long latency that mimics many, many chronic diseases. And probably over the years, we're going to find other chronic diseases that have the etiologic infectious disease nature. And so that blending of the two disciplines that were pretty disparate, you know, in infectious disease and chronic disease, that in our textbook we're trying to bring together as much as possible examples, and HIV is one of the best examples of, you know, in certain situations you can learn a lot from, you know, chronic diseases, but in other situations, infectious disease has unique characteristics about infectious disease epidemiology that make it interesting and separate on its own. And so that really was the aha moment that, you know, transitioning into the infectious disease world from chronic disease.
I did have an aha moment, actually. I was telling some people this at lunch, whoever was sitting at my table. The summer after my junior year in college, I was given an opportunity to travel to Uganda to work with the AIDS support organization. I had been interested in HIV, but not to any extreme degree. And I got to Uganda, and it was like you know, here's a girl who's never been to sub-Saharan Africa and never met someone who's infected with HIV before, and I'm placed in a clinic with tons of HIV positive people, and I just saw the human need, I guess, and that's really what inspired me to continue working in the field.
So Nadia, you mentioned poverty in your, like, as one of the things that goes into the model. So how do we incorporate some of these more extraordinarily complex and tough human conditions into models, or is it even possible?
So to clarify, it's not in our model. So we
Okay.
don't have an aspect of socioeconomic status in our model. The relationship between socioeconomic status and cash transfers and HIV infection is a really hot topic right now. The evidence has slightly been mixed, I would say, in terms of like the benefits of cash transfers or the alleviation of poverty. It's such a huge, it's a infrastructure sort of intervention that would be required to sort of alter that. But I don't know if I don't know of other agent-based models that have sort of dealt with socioeconomic status.
So in almost all the standard behavior change theories, that trust is a very important determinant of whether or not a particular individual will follow the advice of the government or others. And for instance, in public health, we have the health belief model or stages of change, and all of them have some element of whether or not they believe. And so how you represent that, and particularly if you're doing an epidemic spread model. So the way we've been trying to approach it is by taking people according to their sociodemographics, their race, their age, and trying to come up with some estimates of trust within each of those populations and using that as part of how they make decisions. And that it is a pretty crude state of the art right now, but I think it's also sort of the front edge of the state of the art is how do you measure, how do you parameterize behavior change for these sort of intangibles like trust or belief or opinion or things like that, and that's where the fields need to go.
Well, thank you so much to our speakers.